Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Insomnia by Stephen King. So as always, this is going to contain a small non-spoiler section, and then we're going to jump into spoilers where we can talk in a bit more detail. So as always, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and if you're interested in some extras and early releases and reaction videos and stuff, you can of course check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. So with that being said, let's begin. So, Insomnia by Stephen King. It came out in the 90s, 1994, almost exactly 40 years ago, and it is a really interesting novel. It is definitely from a time period when King was very weird, where he was getting very much into his weird kind of ideas and stuff, which honestly might be one of my favorite eras of King. So, I actually really enjoyed this book. I've heard many people talk about how the story is ironically a snooze fest, considering it's about insomnia, but I don't really agree with that. I think it's fascinating in more ways than a lot of people have talked about. And it's also one of those books that is a very deep connection to the Dark Tower series. So there's actually debate on whether or not this book should be read before or after completing the Dark Tower series. I personally don't think you need to have completed the Dark Tower series to read it, but I do think you will get a lot more enjoyment out of it, or this will actually add to your enjoyment of the Dark Tower series, because there are things in this that directly references things in the Dark Tower series, but it's like the canonicity of it is a little dubious because you can tell King hadn't had all of his ideas fleshed out yet. So by the time he actually gets to the Dark Tower series proper, he makes some changes to some of the things that are established in this book. So that's kind of one of those caveats. So I think your mileage in terms of reading it before or after the Dark Tower series, your mileage will vary, and it's going to definitely be person to person. But I would say you really don't need to have completed the Dark Tower series to enjoy this story. So, what I've always found really interesting about Stephen King, in comparison to other horror or fantasy writers that I read a lot, he is one of the few writers that will actively use older protagonists in his stories. It's very rare that I read a story about someone that's over 50, much less over 70. So, it's kind of really interesting, and I really like that kind of diverse thought process, essentially. So, I think the pacing of this book is essentially really slow because it exists inside the mind of someone who's kind of reached a point in their life where everything's a little slower, where they've slowed down and they're kind of, our main character, Robert, basically doesn't kind of see it that way. So I won't really call it like relaxing per se, but a lot of stuff in his life has slowed down. I think King does some pretty interesting stuff with the way he structures this story, because the pretty much the entire first half of the book is very much just kind of day in the life kind of stuff until we kind of make the connections that lead to the more supernatural and horror elements. And then when we hit that point, it's just off to the races. But a lot of people actually have complained about the fact that the first half of the book is like very slow. But I think it kind of has this effect, at least it does for me, of like really allowing me to like basically settle into this warm bath, because the way the characters are, the way they talk and the way they think, and just basically trying to immerse yourself into that mindset, I think actually is, it requires pacing that is a little more slower, a little more thoughtful, a little more, kind of more in the mindset of someone who's retired and stuff. So I think a lot of the pacing and the way in which the slower parts of the book kind of works and play out, I think it actually does lend itself to the overall goal of what this book is essentially was trying to get across, at least the way I see it. Of course I can't, take a stab at it and guess, to know all of King's intentions with the way he wrote the book. But I think I really did resonate with the way he wrote it. And I do like the slower pacing, and I like the fact that the characters are older, because it is very much a different kind of pace than what I'm used to. So, considering this is still the non spoiler section, I'm going to keep it pretty much vague. But I think the crux of the story is very, very interesting conceptually, because King has this thing where he will basically introduce a lot of these concepts and ideas into his world building that have a basis in kind of the, what do I want to call it? Kind of a philosophical thought that is common in real life, like the idea of fate and randomness and this kind of thing. Like a lot of these ideas, exist in our real life, and he just kind of manifests these same ideas in this different way in the books. So when we get into a lot of the supernatural stuff in the story, I was actually kind of confused, because a lot of the terms he uses, a lot of the way he describes the events and stuff that's happening to the characters, there's not very much a touchstone. Like I don't have much of a touchstone to just, immediately understand the way he describes it. But when you start to kind of pull back, you can kind of see these concepts he's playing with. And these concepts very much have names in our reality. So things like faith and chance and, I'm sorry, not faith, but fate. Fate versus chance and like different kind of things like that. I don't want to go too deep into it because I think a lot of this is really interesting when you discover it in the book. So I don't want to give too much detail away, and especially in the non-spoiler section. So I think a lot of the things that King does is really, really well handled, especially his characters. His characters are always really good. That's one of the things that King is just known for. His characters are always great. But his ability to write a character that is either very young or, of a more, I don't know, middle age, I don't know. Like the way he can write characters of pretty much any age range and like allow them to be distinct and different while being incredibly relatable, regardless of how many connective, touchstones I can connect with the characters on. Like it's kind of impressive to me because I obviously don't know what it's like to be a widower or a retiree or someone in their 70s, but the way in which he kind of sees the world and interacts and stuff like that, it resonates really well with me. So I think that's just something that King has always done. At least that's my experience with his writing. A lot of his characters will easily resonate with me and kind of just they have this level of realism to them that is beyond most writers that I read. So that's just one of the things I just really love about King. Sorry, that full section felt very much like I was repeating myself a lot. But I, of course, am trying to be very careful with the spoilers because I want to be a little better about that. But overall, I will say I do think Insomnia is one of the better Stephen King stories. It's not like his top tier. It's not like, up there with the best of his work. But I think it's definitely in a really, really good place. I think it's, I don't know how I would even classify it. But so yeah, to close out the non-spoilery section, I'll say I think this book is really, really well done. I think King does a great job with the characters. I think the setting is very well done because it's a familiar setting. We're back in Derry, Maine, and that's of course a lot of fun. I think all the references he makes to other works and stuff is handled really well. You kind of understand the reference without having to, have read his entire catalog or anything like that. I think the pacing works really well for the story. I really like the way the plot unfolds. I think it's just really well done. I definitely recommend Insomnia to any King fan who has either read The Dark Tower or hasn't read The Dark Tower. But I do think that if you have read The Dark Tower, you will have a lot more fun going, oh, look at that. Like, just a bunch of references and Easter eggs and stuff. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the spoiler section where I can kind of talk a little more, even more rambly. So yeah, let's go ahead. Spoilers for Insomnia by Stephen King. So I really, really like this idea of Lycasis, Atropos, and Clotho. The way in which he makes reference to the Greek fates and use these characters, the small doctors as he calls them or whatever. Like I really like that idea because it is similar to, as I said in the non-spoiler section, it is this concept that we're quite familiar with, but it's reinterpreted in this way that feels very alien while remaining quite familiar. So the three small doctors that he sees after he ends up dealing with his insomnia and stuff and starts to see the auras and start to kind of peel back this layer of reality and starts to see this other layer. So when he actually sees these doctors and they start to kind of think about it and actually put it together, they give them the names of the fates, Clotho, Lycasis, and Atropos. And I think it's perfect. Like it's kind of lampshading King's obvious reference, he clearly wanted to kind of make this story about fate and kind of randomness versus like a purposeful thing. It's very much explicitly on the page, but the themes of the story were very clear. And instead of just kind of using some sort of, the way of saying, oh, these are the fates reincarnated or something like that, he kind of does it, of course, in this very Stephen King way. So we have these entities that I don't think they're technically lowmen or anything like that. They're not. I don't think they're any other type of creature that we've met in the rest of the Dark Tower mythos. I think they're just one of the other creatures that exist, on the different levels of the tower and different levels of reality that, just are minor enough that we never really interact with or anything, that never really become that important in the Dark Tower series. Or it's a case of King just kind of not wrote them out, but like he just forgot that they exist, so he doesn't really deal with it anymore or anything. So it's kind of, it's in there. It's interesting. I don't know. So this idea that the three doctors kind of go around and they call them balloon strings, but it's really like their visible life thread. So when they go around cutting people's life threads, they do it um, either in service of the purpose or in service of the random. So I thought that was just a really really cool idea in the way in which he kind of brings back this idea of fate and destined death, or like living to your time, or like dying early and this kind of thing. So I always thought that was just kind of a interesting play, like using that. And then he uses that entire concept to build basically the entire function of the story. So this is where I kind of got to talk about the thing I don't really like about the story. So King's politics in this one is very heavy-handed. And this is in 94, so I'm not even sure how much of this he still, totally believes. Even though the way in which this is expressed is kind of even-handed, I'll call it. Um, so the a heavy middle part about this book talks a lot about abortion. The inciting incident, the entire like catalytic one of the big culminating events that happened in the book has to do with this woman who is a pro-choice advocate, and she's like going to give a speech and stuff, and then the crux of it is kind of this fight between pro-lifers and pro-choicers and stuff essentially. So through a lot of the story, you get a lot of commentary about this. You get various characters espousing their opinions on the subject and stuff. And my interpretation of it at the time, it appears King is very much in the middle ground. He's very much like his faith doesn't, allow him to be okay with it, but he's not a fan of restricting other people's, choices and rights and stuff. So that seems to be kind of where it falls. But when you have multiple characters, either from one side or the other side, constantly talking about it, you just feel kind of like you're getting beat over the head with this idea. So it's just kind of, it becomes a little ham fisted, a little heavy handed, and a little annoying, more or less, I guess I'll say. For some people, it's probably entirely too much. It'll probably take you completely out of the story and make it difficult to actually enjoy because it's so politically heavy in that way. But if you can just kind of ignore all that in a similar way that kind of our main characters kind of do, because he kind of just like he doesn't really, he just basically, the majority of, even not even, it goes beyond the main character, to be honest. The majority of the people just kind of don't want to deal with it. They just don't want this kind of heavy political animosity, because there's almost definitely violence going to be happening because of it. Like, they just don't want this kind of energy in the town of Derry, because everybody there more or less is retirees and stuff. They're all very calm, living a really cool kind of sedate life. So having all this fem flam show up in their town and stuff, basically everybody has an issue with it. So that's the majority of the perspective that we get when we see a lot of people complaining about it. But again, as I said, it's fairly heavy-handed, and it's not constant, but there's a point in the middle of the book where it feels constant. So that's definitely one of the big negatives I have. And when you get to the conclusion of the book, you kind of learn also that that entire issue wasn't the big deal. Like, the entire purpose is, so the majority of the story is essentially trying to prevent this improper death essentially. The third of the fates is basically working for the Crimson King, and is trying to basically disrupt things that will have, essentially is going to the effort of destroying the Dark Tower. So essentially, they're trying to cause this huge event that will create a random death that will be significant enough to have an effect on the future and essentially destroy the Dark Tower, right? So the whole thing is one of the random people, one of the children of one of the women who will be at the speech when the woman is making her speech, is the person that they want to save. So it's not even about the pro-choice advocate that's speaking, or even about Ed Deepno, who is the pro-life terrorist who's being manipulated by the Crimson King in order to do this kamikaze suicide bomb situation. Like, so it's not even true. I mean, it's about that, but it's like, it's not even those sides. It's really about trying to save this child who is prophesized to play a significant part in the efforts to defeat the Crimson King. So you, from that perspective, you can almost feel like all the abortion stuff, all that political stuff doesn't need to be in the book. You can kind of feel like that, even though it does create a huge catalyst for a lot of the events that happen. So it's I'm of two minds about it, I guess. It wasn't so much that it completely took me out of it, but I can't say that I enjoyed those parts of the story. But it also does feel a little redundant when you find out that the ultimate purpose was not really about that. And the decision King makes to have the pro choice advocate be beheaded kind of feels like a political statement. It feels like he's, coming down on one side or the other. Or he feels like it's even because Ed Deepno, the terrorist guy who's, against all of it, being manipulated also, dies, and so does she. So the two heads of the sides of this battle both die. So maybe he feels that's even, but it doesn't feel that way. It very much feels like he's, making a choice, but ironically, like is actually, making a statement. So it's just interesting. I mean, I guess is I finished the book today, so I'm still kind of very much in the scramble mode on it. That's why this is incredibly rambly. Um, so around the time when our main character and Lois, his friend, basically start to develop essentially their powers because they've been given access to this other layer of reality and stuff. When they started to get access to that and started to kind of play around with that and started to try to hunt down the other one of the doctors, as he calls them, the short guys or whatever, as he tries to hunt them down and stuff like that, stuff get really interesting because the way in which he makes use of this extra layer of reality, these auras, this kind of magic system he creates, is very fascinating. It creates this interesting visual that like everyone has multiple different types of auras, and everything that you are kind of exists in these auras. Like all your thoughts are readable through it, and your intention, your health, your like all of that kind of stuff is just all readable on that level of reality that they have access to. And then they realize they can go even higher to another layer of reality, which basically literally makes them ghost in our physical reality. So like that's an entire concept that's just very fascinating, just the way in which that works. I really wish King would have like continued with that idea and kind of explore that part of his magic system more, but I don't think he does unless it's in some work that I haven't read and am completely unfamiliar with. So I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up since I've been rambling for a decent amount of time. I think that Insomnia is one of the really interesting King books from what I consider to be one of his more interesting eras in his writing, and I really like a lot of the themes and concepts and ideas that are played with here. There's parts of the book that I do not like, but I think overall the book is very, very well done. I think the pacing, though slow, is very deliberate and very well put together. I think the characters are really interesting and very compelling and very fun to continuously read about, even though some of the stuff they do is just, not very eventful. They just have boring days a lot of the time. But I do think it still came across as quite thoroughly enjoyable. I would really like to see an adaptation of this one day if we could ever like do any Dark Tower stuff justice. Like I would really really like that because I think the implication of the visuals that you could get from an adaptation of a story like this would be just it would be so cool. So I really like it. I definitely recommend this book, especially if you've read The Dark Tower. I think it has a lot of fun, interesting connections in it that'll just make reading the Dark Tower series that much more fun. But whether you read it before or after, it's totally up to you. So yeah, all right, that's all I got for today. We were talking about Stephen King's Insomnia. I enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read it, if you enjoyed it. And of course, as always, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you're interested, check out the Patreon for reactions and early releases and things like that. So yeah, with that being said, I will talk to y'all next time. Peace.